Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. By the end of Robert Gordon Menzies' prime ministership in 1966, 71% of people in Australia owned their own home. And this was up from 53% in 1947, just before the beginning of Menzies' prime ministership. Sadly, these days, the affordability and availability of houses in Australia makes this great Australian dream less and less attainable. And today, just 50% of 30 to 34-year-olds and just 36% of 25 to 29-year-olds own their own homes. What can be done to solve this problem? Well, joining me today on Afternoon Light to discuss the answers to this question is Senator Jane Hume. Jane is a Liberal Senator for Victoria and Shadow Minister for Finance and the Public Service and Shadow Special Minister of State. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Jane.
So good to be with you, Georgina.
It's lovely to have you here in the Robert Menzies Institute at your alma mater.
It is. I know I love walking through the law quad. It brings back very happy memories. I never studied law, of course, but I do like walking through the law quad. This was where all the cool kids hung out.
Yes, indeed. Well, I was one of them, so I, of course, agree with you. Jane, home ownership was central to Robert Menzies' vision, part of his pitch in the early 1940s in his Forgotten People broadcast for this Liberal vision for Australia, homes material. Why do you think it is so very essential to that pitch?
I think he really tapped into something that is so fundamental to the Australian psyche. And because he kept reiterating it, and people saw themselves reflected in the values associated with home ownership, it actually became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. It wasn't just because he got the policy settings right. It's because he created that expectation. We know that home ownership has advantages for both the homeowner, but it also has advantages for the community as well. And that sort of idealism that I think existed in Australia at the time that gave you a sense of a place and connectedness, independence and security. And of course, it was home ownership is really the foundation of family and social stability as well, which was really the sort of bedrock of the Menzies era. So it got to that stage where home ownership rates became much higher, and they still are much higher in Australia now than they are in sort of equivalent affluent countries. And while we know that, I'm not suggesting for a second that renters don't have responsibilities or greatly contribute to the community either, but owning your own home is unlike renting. There are additional rights and responsibilities that renting simply doesn't afford, right down to sort of paying council rates and maintaining your home, maintaining gardens and nature strips and all of those sorts of things. But it also gives you the rights to do things with your own property too, expand it if you need to as your family requirements demand or reflect changing lifestyles. So it became not just an indicator of financial security, but a stake in the ground, a stake in Australia.
Well, that's right. I mean, Menzies even calls it, there's this lovely quote from, I think it was the 1944 speech he gave, where he said the material home represents the concrete expression of the habits of frugality and saving for a home of our own. Your advanced socialist may rage against private property even while he acquires it, but one of the best instincts in us is that which induces us to have one little piece of earth with a house and a garden which is ours, to which we can withdraw, in which we can be among our friends, into which no stranger may come against our will. Which it is that connection to just that piece of earth that you can call your own, that you can protect yourself from outside ills or whatever, and gives you that stake in not just that piece of land, but in the nation.
That's right.
Piece of land
that's
is part of.
I loved that idea of homes material, homes human and homes spiritual. It's sort of fully encompassed what home ownership means and why it is so embedded in the national psyche and in the DNA of Menzies liberalism.
Yeah, and I mean, he goes on, without wanting to fill this podcast with just Menzies quotes, but he does go on to say, if you consider it, you will see that if, as in the old saying, the Englishman's home is his castle, it is this very fact that leads on to the conclusion that he who seeks to violate that law by violating the soil of England must be repelled and defeated. So that nexus with patriotism is very strong there. I found it interesting looking at some OECD reports and research into home ownership across those countries. And they listed the economic benefits of home ownership, which pretty much speak to the Menzian values here of wealth accumulation, positive child outcomes, that homeowners are more engaged in their community and it impacts their voting behaviour and their state of civic engagement, that a community of homeowners provides a more stable neighbourhood, which is interesting. The downside is it has a negative impact on labour mobility, which you can understand because you own a home in Melbourne, you don't necessarily want to go and work in Tamworth.
No, that is absolutely true, which is why it's really important to have a thriving rental market as well. Home ownership isn't always going to be for everybody, but removing those artificial obstacles to home ownership, and particularly when we're looking at the moment with this rapidly rising cost of living, I think that it's not just home ownership that's becoming out of reach for younger Australians. It's all of those psychological factors that go with it that are now sort of drifting away from that next generation. This is, and I think you and I have had this conversation before in different contexts, but this is the first generation of young people that haven't felt like that they can do as well or that they will be able to do as well as the generation before, as their parents.
Yeah.
And that doesn't matter even if they do all the right things, if they study hard, if they save their money, if they get a good job, all of those things, they still don't feel like they can get ahead. And home ownership is kind of central to that, which is why it's such an important policy area to address.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly still the aspiration, isn't it? We don't get a sense, even though there is a sense of despair, I know among very young people that they may never ever own a home. That despair is because the aspiration is still there. It's interesting because it is cultural too, isn't it? I mean, you look at the statistics across the world. Australia is, I mean, some countries are up in the 90s, but if you look at sort of comparable countries, Canada's about the same, the US is about the same in terms of home ownership. New Zealand and the UK all sort of are largely around the same. We're lower than we were in the Menzies era, of course. But Germany, I was surprised, is below 50% home ownership. So it's, I think, partly cultural, where perhaps it's the sort of the British, the Anglosphere have more of a tradition of home ownership than the continental Europeans, but who knows?
Perhaps that is so, but whether it's Daryl Kerrigan or Burke's backyard, it's certainly embedded in the Australian psyche.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So before we get into contemporary challenges and how we can solve them, it'd be good to talk about what Robert Menzies did to push through that extraordinary transformation from 53% in 47 to 71% in 66 owning their own home. I mean, that was a pretty incredible turnaround in 24 years.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. And I love the parallels that we're seeing to the contemporary issues today because, of course, that all happened as part of a sort of a post-war reaction. The Labor government during the war or just post-war immediately set up the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement in 1945, which essentially provided low-interest loans to the states for low-income rental housing.
Yeah.
Not dissimilar, dare I say, to the Housing Australia Future Fund, and I know that we will get on to that.
Yeah.
And one of the comments, and I can't remember who it was from a Labor minister at the time. Dedman, was that his name? Who referred to the little capitalists?
Well, yes, it is Dedman. I was guessing you were going to go there.
Yes, the little capitalists, in a very sort of disparaging way. And, of course, that was the quote that Menzies grasped hold of and said, you should be proud to be a little capitalist.
He did.
Owning your own stake. It's almost sort of embodies that sense of aspiration, didn't it? So I loved that. And I know that there's been a number of commentators that have spoken about that particular phrase, that idea that people that through their hard work and through their prudent savings could own something for themselves and for their families too. And I know that Zach Gorman, whose book I launched here, The Young Menzies, there was an article there or a chapter there by Troy Bramston that specifically referred to that phrase as well. So it is amazing those parallels that we've seen now. And the policy positions that Menzies put forward, establishing the building societies that would allow private enterprise to get into building rather than creating what's now known as social housing, I think was quite ingenious. But it was also involved a lot of the federal government involving itself into the sphere of what had previously been the states. And again, that sort of the tensions of federalism is something that we're facing today.
Well, yeah, and then hence the need for this Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, of course. But you're right. I mean, it's interesting to look at what was going on in Australia in the 50s and 60s to really transform home ownership and enable so many more people to own their own homes versus what was happening in Britain at that time. And they stuck with the Chifley-esque emphasis on public housing. And so I think in 1949, British home ownership was at 33%, and it only went up to 45% by 1966. So whereas in Australia it was 71%. And it actually wasn't until Margaret Thatcher's government got in 1980 that council tenants were then allowed to buy their rental properties through the right to buy policy. And only at that time did home ownership in Britain start to catch up with that in Australia. But that sort of emphasis in two countries that shared so much in common, that in Australia we took the private property route, and in Britain they took the public ownership route, and actually the economic outcomes for our societies were quite different.
They certainly were back then. That was very Menzian, wasn't it? Allowing Australians the opportunity to buy government-built homes, which made Australians' accessibility towards affordable homes so much easier. We actually reduced the cost of housing.
Yeah. So, I mean, fast forward to today, it's been, of course, massively in public debates, not just recently, but in the last, I feel like 10 years, we've been talking about this crisis, affordability and availability in Australia. What is the cause of it?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's obviously an extraordinarily complex area. There are lots of levers, both at state level, at a local level, as well as at a federal level or a Commonwealth level. Obviously, at a Commonwealth level, one of the levers that we pull is immigration, which, of course, requires a constant supply of new housing, particularly at the levels we're seeing at the moment. 500,000 people just in the last 12 months alone, of course, is just exacerbating the housing crisis. There is no doubt about that. But of course, interest rate rises don't help either. That is the ultimate dampener on housing affordability. That's why we're seeing, I think, first home buyers now are at their lowest levels since the Gillard government. New home starts have dropped by about 6.6% just in the last 12 months, and new housing approvals have dropped by 13.5% just compared to this time last year. And we know that just a mortgage of around $750,000, which sounds like an awful lot of money, but in fact it's not that far off the average size of a mortgage, is now costing an Australian family around $22,000 a year more than it did last year. Now, $22,000 a year, that's not the sort of money you find down the back of a couch.
No.
So a lot of that, though, is because of the economic settings that we've got right now. If you don't tackle inflation, which can be caused by lots of different things, I think originally the kickers to inflation were energy prices, and a lot of that came out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But if you turn over all of your inflation woes to the Reserve Bank to use monetary policy only rather than tackling it with fiscal policy, well, then, of course, your interest rates are going to go up because they've only got one tool in the shed, the RBA.
Yes.
And it's a very blunt tool, and it specifically hits homeowners more than anybody else. And it has a flow-on effect too to renters because, of course, landlords seek to recoup their costs from higher interest rates too.
Of course.
So I think that's why we're at this perfect storm moment now. But the vagaries of federation are a problem. We know that the states are largely responsible for release of supply.
Yes.
And we also know that local councils, less so in Victoria, and I'll go into that in a moment, but local councils put a lot of grit in the wheels of planning and zoning, which is fundamentally important to make sure that we can open up new supply. It's pretty basic economics, isn't it? If you open up more supply, the cost of housing eventually comes down. Yes, there's supply chain issues. Yes, there's labour issues. There's all sorts of other things going on, but that's the elephant in the room.
Absolutely. And there is a problem too that we tend to be a highly urbanised country around coastal cities and very few coastal cities. I mean, we actually have, it's always interesting to note this when you go to Britain or the US, how their cities, major cities, are not often as big as our major cities, yet they're Manchester. Of course, you've heard of Manchester or Birmingham, but in actual fact, Melbourne and Sydney are bigger than those cities, but we cluster around 5 or 6 cities in Australia, whereas other countries will have a much more spread population, which at least does, I presume, mean that housing costs in relative terms so extraordinarily high. So what's the answer to that? Because people want to live where the jobs are, where their friends and family are.
That's true.
Where the action is.
That's true. I mean, look, so much more needs to be done on that issue of zoning and property use, I think. We do restrict a lot of land usage in capital cities, and I think that's something that probably needs a rethink. That idea of the sort of satellite cities is always one that we've grappled with. In my home state of Victoria, we've always spoken about Geelong and Frankston and places like that.
High-speed rail,
all of those things. And that's
Can's been kicked down the road of that one again.
But you've kind of cottoned onto something there. Infrastructure between those towns, if it doesn't happen, if it's not there, it's very hard for those to become sort of second cities. Somewhere like a Ballarat, if there was high-speed rail between Ballarat and Melbourne, you would see Ballarat grow exponentially. Same goes for Geelong. But sadly, I think part of that is just tyranny of distance, and part of it is just poor planning for infrastructure.
But immigration is a major challenge here. I mean, we've seen extraordinary increase in the last year of numbers of immigrants coming to this country, and business community was absolutely calling for more and more people to come into Australia because there were just jobs everywhere and no one to fill them. So that responds to a need. But of course, if you come to Australia, you need a roof over your head, and a roof over your head means, well, renting or buying. And that again puts pressure for Australian citizens who were here before. Where do we go with that? I mean, do we want an even bigger Australia, or are we? Well, I think that's wanting to shut the door. Or?
That's a topic for another podcast, a big Australia podcast. But you're right, which is why we know that we need the immigrants to fill the labour shortages.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons why we have the labour shortages is because there is so much demand on so many industries to simply house the immigrants. It does become a bit of a vicious cycle.
It does, yeah.
More importantly, I think, and this is, again, probably a topic for another day, but the big drivers of economic growth are, productivity, population and participation. Our participation rates are pretty high. Our population is growing. It's our productivity that's lagging.
Yeah.
And productivity is embedded in every single sector, and housing is just one of them. If you can remove the grit in the wheels on things like zoning laws, on opening up new supply, and we did one in government that was so basic, just a recognition of trade qualifications across state boundaries. Something like that actually reduces the costs of being a tradie and doing business, which allows that part of the market to flourish. So there are things that you can do, and not all of them are, great big Housing Australia Future Fund, these sorts of massive big ideas. A lot of them are just simply removing the red tape and the green tape from making sure that even if you've got this great weight of capital, that it's got somewhere to go.
So tell me about the impact of planning laws, though, on increasing supply, because there are lots of demand-side levers that governments have pulled, but it always seems to me to be the supply issue that we can't overcome.
Yeah.
And I know that Centre for Independent Studies, I think it was, did a report into what was really pushing up the cost of housing, and they basically said it's local government.
Yeah, but the problem is, what do you do about that? I can understand that, but local people deserve a say in what is built in their own areas. I do think that decentralisation is quite important here. For instance, I was out in Moorabool Shire a few weeks back in Belied, and the local council out there was saying that they have 18,000 houses, 100% ready to go. They've got the land, they've got the builders, they've got the lot. But what they're waiting for is the centralised state government tick-off, and they've been waiting for more than 18 months. 18,000 houses. Now, what's the holdup? What is the holdup?
What is the holdup?
I genuinely don't know, and neither did they. They are literally waiting for a state government, a Labor state government tick-off for 18,000 houses. Now, what upsets me most about that is that because so much money has been now thrown at the states for housing, are those 18,000 houses going to be included, like just business as usual, rather than the new money is going to create additional housing? I just don't know. And the reason why that is because the agreement between the Commonwealth and the states is so opaque at the moment. We know that there were $2 billion that was found down the back of a couch about 2 or 3 weeks after the budget.
It's a nice big couch.
Yes, it was a big couch. And that went to the states for social housing. There were no KPIs. There was actually no obligation on the federal government to even report back as to how many houses will be built within what time frame? And that's now been increased to $3 billion, so rather than $2 billion, as part of the sweetener to get the Greens across the line on the Housing Australia Future Fund.
All right. Well, we'll get to the Housing Australia Future Fund, but I would like to just talk about the 9 years of coalition government that came to an end, of course, last year. And you were a very senior figure in that government. You held a number of portfolios. You were the first ever Minister for Women's Economic Security. You were Minister for Superannuation, Financial Services and the Digital Economy. And, of course, prior to that, were Assistant Minister for Superannuation, Financial Services and Financial Technology. And you've been Chair of the Standing Committee on Economics. So you have, I know, a lot of experience in the economic policies of the coalition government over the years you were in the Senate while they were in government, from 2016, of course. But I mean, this problem has not just appeared in the last couple of years. This is a problem that we've been facing for some time. What wasn't working that the Morrison government and predecessor Abbott and, of course, Turnbull in that reverse order, apologies, why weren't those prime ministerships able to deal with this crisis?
Well, actually, we kind of did. I mean, to be honest, we had a really strong record for support for home ownership alongside of funding for social and affordable housing, which is primarily the responsibility of the states. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So the first home buyers reached their highest level for 15 years under the last coalition government, which is something that we were really proud of. The number of first home buyers rose from around 100,000 or so when we came to office to around 180,000 in our last full financial year in government. So there were a lot more people buying homes under the coalition. We established NIFIC, which is the National Housing, I always get that acronym wrong, National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, which about to have a dramatic transformation, a name change to Housing Australia.
Probably an easier acronym, really.
Well, potentially, so that is true. But NIFIC did two things. One of it was establish the National Housing Infrastructure Facility. So that was $1 billion fund that financed critical housing infrastructure rather than the houses themselves to speed up new housing.
So this is
supply
the roads
opening
and
up.
Sewage
That's
and
That's
water
exactly
and gas.
right. So that was a supply side lever that we could pull. And the other thing that it did was establish an affordable housing bond aggregator, which essentially meant that community housing providers and builders could access finance at the same sort of rates government could.
Right.
It was a very, very successful establishment, a very successful institution, NIFIC. About $2.9 billion of low-cost loans to community housing providers went out the door, and that supported about 15,000 or so social and affordable dwellings and unlocked about 6,500, maybe a little bit more, nearly 7,000 social and affordable market dwellings as well through the infrastructure facility. But we also used that during COVID to establish the Home Builder Scheme, which essentially kept the construction industry alive and kept the economy afloat throughout COVID. That was really important. But there was also the Home Guarantee Scheme. So that allowed people on particularly things like single-parent families and first home buyers to buy a home with a smaller deposit. They still had to repay the whole amount and everything else, but it's just establishing that deposit was becoming harder and harder.
Yeah.
So that was a really big deal and very successful program and has been continued by this government. I'm very pleased to see. And about half of those 60,000 guarantees that we issued in the last government were taken up by women too, more than half, which is great to see. And then on top of that, of course, we established the First Home Super Saver Scheme, which allowed people to save for their first home within superannuation, take advantage of those higher returns. So that's kept going. The one that the government has rejected was a policy that we announced during the election campaign, which was the Super Home Buyer Scheme. And that allows first home buyers to access some of their superannuation savings. That's the stuff that goes in compulsorily as opposed to the voluntary stuff, which is the Super Home Saver Scheme. It was up to $50,000 to help with the purchase of their own home. That recognises that we now are paying 11% compulsorily of our income as savings for our retirement. One of the biggest indicators of economic security in retirement is home ownership. So it makes perfect sense to be able to take money out of your retirement savings, buy that home. When you sell the home, the money goes back into super plus the earnings that you've made on that home, any capital gain. So you get the best of both worlds. You're not robbing your retirement savings, but you're getting that first foot in the door or first foot on a rung of the property ladder.
Yeah. And this isn't just buying some smashed avo on toast.
No.
It's about putting a roof over your head. So
that's exactly right.
And it's a pretty good investment.
And as Robert Menzies said, it's part of that sense of that savings and frugality that comes with home ownership.
Absolutely.
And all the benefits that come with it.
What about the baby boomer generation? There's criticism that they live in these big houses that, they brought up their children in, and hear of these couple living in a 5-bedroom house and they just don't want to sell. Should there be incentives for those people to move out of their houses?
Well,
I mean, I don't believe in kicking people out of their homes. Of course not. But I think incentives where that house might more appropriately be occupied by a family of 5.
Well, that was almost a Dorothy Dixon, Georgina. I felt really bad that you did that. So one of the other policies that we had was a downsizer contribution, which allowed people to sell their big family home and put up to $300,000 each, if they were a couple, into their superannuation in a very tax-effective way, that they could go beyond their limits, their contribution limits to superannuation, if they did it by downsizing their home. And so that was a tax incentive to encourage people to do exactly what it is that you're saying, maintain that sort of churn in the market.
And was that taken up?
Yeah, it was actually very popular. And again, it's not something that the current government has disbanded, so that's a good thing.
Oh, that is a good thing. Yes, well, I think it's a good thing. I mean, my humble opinion. So now that we have the Albanese government, they've been in for just over a year, almost a year and a half, and to great fanfare, they announced the Housing Australia Future Fund. Give me your take on this policy.
I hate it's this terrible thing to say. I hate this policy. I hate this policy for not because of its intention. Don't get me wrong. Social and affordable housing is important.
Yes.
It is important.
And can we just unpack that? Because I think there maybe has been a bit of a misunderstanding or a lack of explanation, at least, of what is meant by social and affordable housing.
Well, they are two separate things, aren't they?
Yeah.
Affordable housing is one thing. Social housing is provided by the state.
Yes.
Affordable housing is exactly what it is. It's what it says to me.
Mm-hmm.
And this is about social housing, which has primarily been the responsibility of the states to deliver. Yeah. And we have had numerous agreements with states that have promised an awful lot, and simply the states, they're not living up to their end of the bargain. They just haven't for years. The Housing Australia Future Fund essentially puts the federal government in charge of social housing, which I'm not comfortable with at all. I don't like that constitutional overreach, and that's wrong. So let's put that aside for the moment, though. The problem is what they've done is borrowed $10 billion on your behalf. And they've said, we'll give that to the Future Fund to run. Now, the Future Fund are a great organisation. They do great things, but they're not free. It's not a free service.
No.
So they're borrowing $10 billion. They're putting it into the Future Fund. The borrowings themselves at current interest rates is probably about $400 million a year just to service. Then you put it in the Future Fund that are going to charge, let's say, 1%. So that's $100 million a year. So that's $500 million a year. $500 million a year. This is going to cost you just to run. Then the Future Fund invests it. Obviously, it invests in Australian equities, international equities, bonds, property, ironically. And whatever return it makes, it can then invest in social housing.
Right.
Now, had this fund been legislated for a year ago, the Future Fund made a loss last year. Had the fund been legislated a year ago, this thing would have not only cost you $500 million in servicing, but it would have lost $370 million in its first year. So $870 million just disappeared with nothing to show, but not a single house built. And I will lay you odds, even though it has gone through now, it was legislated last week with the help of the Greens and an additional $1 billion, I will lay you odds that by the time we get to the next election, Labor will not be able to point to a single house and say that the Housing Australia Future Fund built that. Not one.
Because Jim Chalmers, Federal Treasurer, he said, I think earlier this year, that the federal government had set a target of 1 million new homes to be built over 5 years from 2024, which actually is a figure largely in line with the current level of housing being built, which is about a rate of 200,000 houses a year. So he actually, it's not very aspirational, 1 million houses over 5 years. It's just saying we want to continue.
But at the same time, it's the state, it's government crowding out the private sector because those million houses, they would have been built at some point or another by the private sector. Now, this creeping nationalism, and we've seen it not just in the Housing Australia Future Fund, we've also seen it in the National Reconstruction Fund, which takes an equity stake in people's businesses in areas that we've identified as manufacturing priorities. Or I feel deeply uncomfortable when government starts taking stakes in what should be private enterprise. And the next step, of course, is Labor's big signature policy, which is co-ownership with new home buyers.
Yeah, so this is the affordable housing piece.
That's right.
So how does that policy work?
Well, we haven't seen the details of it yet, but essentially my understanding is that they are going to co-own your house with you until you can pay them off. It's like essentially the government being part of the bank, but they take an equity stake, not a debt stake.
Right. So I buy a house and I have some co-ownership arrangement with the federal government. So I might own 70% and the federal government own 30%. And then what at the end of
it, when you sell it, you pay back the federal government
30% of the sale price. Right. Okay. Oh, well,
now, that's my understanding. I haven't seen any detail come out about that yet. There has been no legislation presented to the Parliament, so we'll see whether they can sort of shave off the rough edges. But I feel instinctively uncomfortable when the state starts crowding out the private sector and taking stakes in what should be private property and private ownership.
So it's interesting. The Greens, were established, of course, as a party of environmental activism. I mean, Bob Brown has an incredible story of what he's done from the early 1980s with Tasmanian Dam, the Franklin Dam, of environmental activism. So it was established as a party that really had a focus on those issues, but latterly has become focused on economic issues, and one at the moment is renters, the cause of renters. And the Greens have been highly vocal in their support or not for this Housing Australia Future Fund legislation, and eventually have come to the table. But they have really pushed for a range of policies around supporting the cause of renters, rent caps, rent freezes and the like, which it's interesting hearing economists talk about the lived experience of those policies around the world. It's really
disastrous.
Yeah. I mean, you don't get the benefits that instinctively people think, well, you just freeze rents. That's great. I don't have to pay more rent for however many years. But tell me, how do you address the cause of renters? Because it is a problem for young Australians and there doesn't seem to be a panacea. So always talking about buying a house. I mean, it's all very well and good, but it seems to be just such a far off prospect for young people that, maybe giving renters some focus and support is fair enough.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's lots of different ways you can do that. Obviously, the Commonwealth does have Commonwealth Rent Assistance, and that is now, I think it's around $6 or $7 billion a year. So it's not a small amount of money. But again, the answer really is supply. Once there is more supply of rental housing, well, then the renters are in a far more powerful position. Whereas at the moment, theoretically, the landlords are in the more powerful position because they can adjust their rents. The problem is government intervention is getting to the stage where landlords are throwing their hands up in the air saying, I don't want to be part of this anymore. It's all too complicated. If you're going to put rental freezes or rent caps or whatever it is on preventing me from making any money out of this investment, well, why would I be here? I'll go and find a much simpler investment in the stock market or whatever it might be. They actually rent caps have the perverse effect of pushing up rental prices in the short term, and they undermine the supply of new stock in the long term. So we would never support a rent cap. But you can see why the Greens are going there, because if you're a renter, it's very easy to say, if someone just would put a cap on my rent, that's a very appealing policy and that can be done tomorrow.
Yes, that's right, because when you start talking about supply, that's all very well and good, Jane, but quite frankly, even if you solve the supply problem today, those houses are not going to come online, or apartments, for 5-10 years. And if I'm a renter in 2023 and someone offers me a supply solution or a rent cap solution, I might just go, well, you know what? Rent cap today means more money in my pocket, less money in my landlord's pocket. Today, actually, I might like the sound of that versus some amorphous solution that might or might not come off in 5-10 years' time.
Yeah. So wouldn't it be better if we removed some of the other obstacles to keeping rents lower? For instance, and the best example I can come up with is land tax. And obviously this is a state-based tax, not a federal tax. So it's not something that, I personally can have a policy position on. But land tax has increased, particularly in Victoria, so dramatically recently that now a lot of landlords were saying that it just simply isn't economic for them to provide longer term and stable leases. It's much better for them to do, for instance, an Airbnb where they can have seasonally adjusted rents. So you can see the perverse effect of overtaxation, I think, in the housing market. So it's one of those things that it's very much the waterbed. You press down on one area of the waterbed and another bit's going to bob up. But to be honest, I think the more you can allow the market to solve a problem, you always are better off. This is one that there is so much intervention from governments, state and federal. If we could peel away some of the layers, I think that we would be much better off.
Well, I think people would appreciate a solution. That's for sure.
But the solution doesn't always have to be more taxes. And that's I think, where we really struggle. And it seems to be the knee-jerk reaction of a Labor government is we can fix this through taxing people more, rather than how can we repeal taxes? How can we remove some of the layers of red tape? How can we get out of people's way so that the market can sort this out?
Do you think, though, amongst the state governments, is there a sense of urgency that more land needs to be opened up? I mean, you give the example of Ballin in Moorabool Shire, where 18,000 houses are ready to go, just still haven't been ticked off by the state government. I'm assuming similar types of issues are across Australia. Where is that sense of urgency then? Because the state governments can't be impervious to the concerns of young people particularly.
Well, this is a very good question, and it worries me that I keep thinking, oh gosh, if we were a Liberal government, coalition government that were in power at a federal level and at every state level across the mainland, the things that we could do around housing supply would be fantastic. I can't understand what's going on in those national cabinet meetings if you cannot get very clear agreements. Why Anthony Albanese can't get firm commitments from his Labor counterparts in each state to deliver what clearly all Australians are looking for. And I think it actually speaks volumes of the respect in which the Prime Minister is held by his Labor premiers. Obviously, their power was elevated and their profiles were elevated during COVID. That hasn't yet necessarily subsided. And now we're seeing that it's not competitive federalism. It's very different. It's actually sort of aggravated federalism almost, which is very disappointing. If it were me, I would love an opportunity to bang premiers' heads together and say, come on, fix this. Now, they're saying that that's what they're doing, but where? What is it? What are the KPIs? How many houses will be built? Where would they be built? This should all be clear and transparent. It should be out there in the open, and it's just not.
So, Jane, what is then, from your perspective, the Liberal alternative to the Housing Australia Future Fund? I mean, is it another Commonwealth state housing agreement that ties funding to the states by requiring them to open up tracts of land and approve land for housing? What sort of set of policies would you go to an election, for example, champion the cause of young people? Because I think ultimately, and you look at the studies that have been done recently into voting behaviour, the problem for your side of politics is that young people don't see their needs being responded to in the policies from coalition governments. So they see Adam Bandt saying the Greens are the party of renters. Well, that sounds pretty good if you're a renter and they're invariably young people. So I guess this is a challenge for the coalition, for the Liberal side of politics, is how do you champion the cause of renters through some sort of Commonwealth state approach to the housing problem?
Well, I think we can certainly champion the cause of homeowners.
Yes.
And aspiring homeowners. Because let's not forget that, yes, while about a third of Australians rent, about a third have a mortgage and about a third own their own homes, a proportion of those renters that aspire to be homeowners one day, and particularly young people. That's why I think—
Would you say it's most renters aspire to be homeowners?
I would imagine, going back to our original conversation, that it's part of the Australian psyche. So I think deep down in the back of people's minds, even those that are really doing it tough right now, they probably aspire to own their own home one day, have a little piece of Australia, all of their own. And so, yes, I think that is the case. So that's why I think that policy of allowing people to access their superannuation to buy a home is a really important one, because it is instant access to one of the biggest obstacles to home ownership, which is gathering together the deposit. The problem, of course, is that's a demand issue. We have to open the supply side as well. And that is going to be establishing those understandings with the states that have clear outcomes-focused tied funding. You're absolutely right. Rather than just this, look, here's another $1 billion, you build some more homes. That would be great. Now, how do we do that? That means the state government's going to have to work with their local councils far better, and potentially we will have to work with local councils too. We know if we can establish a better relationship between federal government and local council, so be it. But we're going to have to start thinking about removing some of the red tape, whether it be environmental approvals or zoning usage, who's responsible for the liabilities for cleanups and all sorts of things. We just have to think about it smarter. rather than just using this one great big, we've got $10 billion, so this will fix it kind of mentality.
Indeed. I wondered too whether part of the problem in Australia is this attachment to a certain type of house. And I mean, this is out of left field, but do we all expect a 4-bedroom house with a garden in a suburb and with a nice quiet street, whereas go to London or New York, people live in apartments and they have families in apartments, and maybe we need to be a bit more open to that urban density option. I think there is an increasing move to apartment living, but having lived in Tokyo, for example, where almost no one has a house. I mean, absolutely live in an apartment. You buy an apartment if you can buy your own home, but there's not an expectation of living in a house at all. It's just not the way they live. In Australia, I think our great Australian dream is still for a quarter-acre block and the white picket fence. It potentially
is.
A pool.
Yeah, you're right. But there are certain ways that you can adjust that.
Yeah.
And we're now beginning to see move towards multi-generational homes.
Yes.
What happened to the good old granny flat?
Yeah.
The granny flat is actually the great Australian invention, and there should be more of it because that solves
free babysitting.
It's
great. Yeah.
No, but it solves so many problems at the same time. It takes the pressure off the aged care system. It's good for family relationships and community and loneliness, and that's right. And as you say, child rearing as well. All of that can be solved with something as basic as getting local councils to look on the building of a granny flat more favourably.
Yeah, which is a problem. Yeah. It's very hard to do, isn't it?
Exactly right.
Just before I let you go, one of your other hats is chair of the Cost of Living Committee, and I'd be interested in how you see the impact of the housing crisis compounding that sense of desperation people have about the rising cost of living.
Oh, absolutely. And it's because obviously it's not just interest rates, meaning that mortgages are more expensive or rents are going up, but you're right, it's compounding with electricity bills and insurance costs, grocery bills. All of it is compounding to make it everybody feeling like that they're despairing that their dollar isn't going anything like as far as it used to be, even if your wage is going up, because cost of living is so high, your real wages are going backwards. You do feel like you're going backwards, which is why I think that the most important thing, you asked what a sort of coalition government would do, the most important thing that we could possibly do to make home ownership more accessible is to improve the state of the economy, is to make sure that we bring inflation under control, that we control government spending, that natural urge of all governments of all hues to spend more, because that means inflation, and there's always that inflationary pressure that's bubbling below the surface. So that would be, I think, a fundamental priority of the next government, is to make sure that you have an economy that is ticking along, that has plenty of employment opportunities, where inflation is low, because that is the best environment to allow for affordable housing solutions.
Well, Senator Jane Hume, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light to talk about this incredibly important topic, and of course a topic that really captured the imagination and attention of the founder of the Liberal Party of Australia and Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, Robert Menzies. And let's hope that there is lots more discussion and lots more ideas about how to deal with it, because it's not a problem that's going away anytime soon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, Georgia.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.